Hello everyone, this week we are going to talk about gaining from international trade. So let's first talk about the trade sector of the United States. Here you see two graphs on the screen, and as it's shown, both exports and imports have grown substantially as a share of the US economy since 1960s. The size of the trade sector as a share of GDP more than doubled during 1960 and 2000. And since 2000, the growth of the trade sector as a share of the economy has slowed. Reductions in both transportation and communication costs, as well as lower trade barriers, have contributed to this growth. So what are the leading trading partners of the US? As you can see, China, Canada, Mexico, and Japan are the leading trading partners. Also, US trades with European Union countries. And the impact of international trade varies across industries. In some industries, US firms are able to compete quite effectively, while in others, they find it difficult to do so. So let's first talk about gains from specialization and trade. Most international trade is not between the government of different nations, but rather between the people and the firms located in different countries. As we know that free markets, we have voluntary exchange. That's true for international trade as well. Both buyer and seller expect to gain, and they generally do. If both parties didn't expect to gain, then they would not agree to the exchange. With trade, a country's residents can gain by specializing in the production of goods that they can produce economically. So the domestic producers will focus on the productions that they can produce economically, and they can sell these goods in the world market and use the proceeds to import goods that would be expensive to produce domestically. So here the key point understanding the gains from trade is the law of comparative advantage. So what is law of comparative advantage? A group of individuals, regions, or nations can produce a larger joint output if each specializes in the production of goods in which it is a low opportunity cost producer and trades for goods for which it's a high opportunity cost producer. International trade leads to mutual gain because it allows each country to specialize more fully in the production of those things that it does best according to the law of comparative advantage. And trade makes it possible for each country to use more of its resources to produce those goods and services that it can produce at a relatively low cost. With trade, it will be possible for the trading partners to consume a bundle of goods that it would be impossible for them to produce domestically. So here, one example that you see on the screen, we have two countries, US and Japan, and we have two goods, food and clothing. Japanese workers can produce 3 units of food per day compared to only 2 units per day for US workers. Japanese workers can also produce 9 units of clothing per day compared to 1 unit of clothing per day for US workers. So that means Japan is producing more output for both products that are listed on this table. 3 versus 2 and 9 versus 1. That means Japan has an absolute advantage. So the question is, are gains from trade possible when one country such as Japan has an absolute advantage in the production of both commodities? The answer is yes, because we need to focus on comparative advantage, not absolute advantage when we talk about gains from trade. So let's look at who's the low opportunity cost producer for food and who's the low opportunity cost producer for clothing. So here, if Japan wants to produce one more food here, how many clothes that the Japan needs to sacrifice? So if every day either you produce 3 food versus 9 clothes, that means you need to sacrifice 9 clothes to get 3 foods. For 1 additional food, you need to sacrifice 1/3 of the 9 clothes, right? Which is the 3 clothes. So instead of 1 additional food, Japan needs to give up the production of 3 clothes. So here, the opportunity cost of 1 food for Japan, now let's write it here. This is US, this is Japan. Food and clothing is 3 clothes. And for the clothing, it's just the reverse of this, the opportunity cost, 1/3 of food. Now let's do that for the US. If US wants to produce 1 additional food, the US needs to sacrifice half a cloth because either US can choose 2 food or 1 clothing, but in this case, 1 additional food requires half a clothing. So half clothes. And here, to produce 1 more clothing, US needs to give up 2 food. So these are the opportunity costs, right? Now we need to find out which country has comparative advantage in food production. US needs to sacrifice half clothes, Japan needs to sacrifice 3 clothes, therefore US has a comparative advantage in food production. And here, in this case for clothing, US needs to sacrifice 2 food, and Japan needs to sacrifice 1/3 food to get additional clothing, therefore Japan has comparative advantage. So the trade says that US should specialize in the production of food and Japan should specialize in the production of clothing. That's what comparative advantage tells us. So we can see the summary here. Which country is the low opportunity cost producer of food? The opportunity cost for a unit of food in Japan is 3 units of clothing. In the US, the opportunity cost for a unit of food is 1/2 a unit of clothing, as I showed you in the previous slide. Thus, the US is the low opportunity cost producer of food. Which country is the low opportunity cost producer of clothing? The opportunity cost for a unit of clothing in Japan is 1/3 of a unit of food. In the US, the opportunity cost of a unit of clothing is 2 units of food. Thus, Japan is the low opportunity cost producer of clothing. Next question is, what happens when each specializes in the area of its comparative advantage, which in this case food for the US and clothing for Japan? If the US moves 3 workers from the clothing, from here, each worker produces 2 units of food, therefore it's going to be additional 6 units. 3 times 2 is 6 units, more food. And because now the clothing industry is going to lose 3 workers, there is going to be -3 less clothing. That means -3 means there will be less clothing. Each worker produces 1 cloth, 3 of them is 3 clothes. If Japan moves 1 worker from the food to clothing, it produces 9 additional clothes with that additional worker, but at the same time, it's going to lose 3 units of food. When we look at the total output for the food production, we have 3 units of food and additionally 6 units of clothing. With such a reallocation of labor, the US and Japan are able to increase their aggregate output of both food and clothing. Let's now check the production possibilities curve before specialization and trade. Here you can see the daily production of the labor force of both US, which is 200 million workers, and Japan, 50 million workers, given the production cost of food and clothing from the previous slide. In the absence of trade, consumption possibilities will be restricted, points like US 1 here. 150 units of clothing and 100 million units of food. And for Japan, it's going to be 225 million units of clothing and 75 million units of food. Each of these points lies along the production possibility curves, therefore they are efficiently produced using all the resources the countries have. Now let's introduce the trade. Trade expands consumption possibilities for both countries. Now instead of 200 million clothing, the US has 400 million, so the PPC shifts outward. And for the Japan has more food, increasing from 150 to 450. For example, with specialization and trade, US could increase its consumption from US 1 to US 2 on the new production possibilities curve. And with that new curve, now US is consuming 200 clothes and 200 million of food, which is higher than previous production. Simultaneously, Japan could increase its consumption from J1 to J2, and now Japan is also consuming more of the both goods. Now the next question is, how exactly do the US and Japan consume at US2 and J2? US produces 400 million units of food and consumes only 200 of them and exports the 200 to Japan. So therefore, Japan's production possibilities increases by 200 million food. And Japan produces 450 million units of clothing and consumes only 250 million and then exports 200 million to the US. Therefore, each consumes more than it could produce domestically. In addition to gains from specialization in areas of comparative advantage, international trade also leads to gains from economies of scale, which in this case, international trade allows both domestic producers and consumers to gain from reductions in per unit cost. that often accompany large-scale production. So when you have large-scale production, you can buy inputs at a cheaper price, and also the worker specializes in the workplace. Therefore, it leads to economies of scale. That means you produce each product at a lower cost. And also more competitive markets. International trade promotes competition in domestic markets and allows consumers to purchase a wider variety of goods at economical prices. Next, let's talk about supply, demand, and international trade. So here, US has a comparative advantage in the soybeans production. And now we will compare two cases. First, there is free trade, which now the price of the soybean is determined by the price in the world and the supply of the soybean by the world and the demand for the soybean in the world. And here, US markets, you can see that a different story. The price determined by the world market is higher than the local price if there is no trade. If US soybean producers were prohibited from selling to foreigners, the domestic price will be PN. And free trade permits US soybean producers to sell QP units at higher prices. So now QP units compared to QP units, now you're selling QN units. Here the producers are losing because they can be able to sell more at a higher price with the free trade, but because if the free trade is not allowed, they are going to sell at a PN price at a QN unit. At the world price of PV, the quantity between the QP and QC is going to be exported. Because at that high price, the demand is going to be QC and the world demand is QP, so the difference is going to be exported. Compared to the no trade situation, the producers gain from higher price, and they gain this shaded area, A, B, C, this triangle. So you might say that, okay, the domestic consumers are going to lose because of the high prices, but the gain in producer surplus is higher than the loss that we have in consumer surplus. For that reason, trade is actually beneficial when you look at the total surplus in the market economy. But there is also another part to this story. Foreigners have a comparative advantage as well. For instance, think about here, this is the shoe market, and the shoes prices, if there is no trade, is high, PN, and the quantity demanded is QN. But in the world market, there are foreigners who can produce shoes at a lower price here. So if there is a free trade, maybe the consumers are losing the soybean at a higher price, but they are going to gain buying shoes at a cheaper price. Compare this, the world price and the domestic price. Because of the trade, now the consumers are going to gain this triangular area, A, B, C. International trade and specialization result in lower prices and more domestic consumption for imported products and higher prices and less domestic consumption for exported products. Trade makes it possible for domestic producers to obtain higher prices for the items they export and for domestic consumers to buy imported items at lower prices. As a result, the residents of each nation are able to focus more of their resources on the things they do best, produce at a low cost, while trading for those goods for which they are high opportunity cost producers. Now let's talk about the economics of trade restrictions. So when we look at the US economy, the tariff, which is the taxes levied upon imports for the United States, are declining. It was very high before 1950s and it's now around 4.9%. Now let's talk about a tariff on auto imports. Without a tariff, world price is PW and the quantity sold is Q1 and domestic sellers are selling QD1. And if we have a tariff, then the price increases to price of the world plus T. When the price increases, now the quantity demanded for at this price for the world market is Q2 and the domestic demand is going to increase from QD1 to QD2. So tariff makes it more costly for Americans to purchase autos from abroad. The reason is because prices jump from PW to PW plus tax. And that reduces the world imported products from Q1 to QT. US purchases from domestic producers rise from QD1 to QD2 and the imports fall to Q2 minus QD2. This part represents the reduction in the imports. And producers gain S, this area, and tax revenues from tariff are generated for the government. This is for government. And this U and V are deadweight losses. Why? Because now consumers who can be able to buy at PW price cannot be able to buy, so they left the market. That's why it's the case. And here, the consumers in the domestic market can be able to pay this price before, but now because of the tariff, they need to pay higher prices for domestic products as well. This is a loss as well. And also this goes to the tax tariff, and therefore this much people are not going to buy imported cars. So therefore consumers lose S plus U plus T plus V in the form of higher prices and the reduction of consumer surplus. Now let's look at the case of a quota. Very similar story. Quota is the restrictions on the products that could be sold in the market. But when you restrict the number of products could be sold in the market, prices also rise from PW to P2. And you can see that again, imported products demand is going to decrease. Therefore, this is another deadweight loss for the consumers. And here, now the domestic cars are more expensive, the demand increases, but they were here before. Now their prices are rising, therefore it's a loss for the consumer as well. US producers gain S, area T goes to the foreign producers with permits to import. Areas UV are deadweight loss, consumers lose S plus U plus T plus V in the form of higher prices and the reduction of consumer surplus. So if trade restrictions are not good for the countries, why do nations adopt trade restrictions? Proponents of trade restrictions often use the following arguments in an effort to justify their position. The first one is national defense argument. Domestic industry is needed for national defense purposes. Second one is dumping. The sale of goods abroad at a price below the cost of production and below the domestic market price. Therefore, the domestic companies cannot compete. But dumping is illegal under US law. Infant industry argument. In this argument, it says that new industries needs protection so that it can mature and be ready for competitive markets in the world market. When considering the merits of anti-dumping restrictions, remember that firms with large inventories, either domestic or abroad, may find it in their interest to offer goods at prices below their original cost of production. And domestic firms are legally allowed to engage in this practice, and lower prices benefit domestic consumers. Let's talk about trade barriers and popular trade fallacies. Trade fallacies exist because people often fail to consider the secondary effects. Key elements of international trade are often linked. You cannot change one element without changing the other. This is the case with imports and exports. Policies that restrain imports also restrain exports. The first trade fallacy is trade restrictions that limit imports save jobs for Americans. This view is false because if foreigners sell less to us, they will have fewer dollars with which they can buy more exports. Therefore, when you put a restriction on imports, you are actually restraining exports as well. Trade restrictions do not save jobs, they merely reshuffle them. Jobs saved in the protected industries will be offset by jobs lost in export industries. As the result of trade restrictions, fewer Americans are employed in areas where we have comparative advantage. The second fallacy is about the wages. Free trade with low-wage countries such as Mexico and China will reduce the wages of Americans. The Americans are paid high because of their high skills and expertise and the capitals that they have. Both high and low-wage countries will gain when they are able to focus more of their resources on those productive activities that they do well. The key to this issue is how will US resources be used? If a low-wage country can supply a good cheaper than we can produce it, the US can gain by purchasing the good from the low-wage country and using its resources to produce other goods for which it has a comparative advantage. And the next topic, which is the last topic, is the institutions and the changing nature of global trade. We use Economic Freedom Index as a measure of institutional quality. Gains from trade, entrepreneurial discovery, and investment are largely dependent on the institutions and policies supportive of voluntary exchange, market allocation, freedom to compete, and protection of people and their property from aggressors. These ingredients comprise the foundation of Economic Freedom Index. Now you can see on the screen the top most open countries, which their trade openness is measured, and their GDP per capita and their GDP growth rate compared to 10 least open economies. And as you see, 10 least open economies have lower GDP and sometimes even negative and very low growth rates with lower GDP per capita. Note that, given this table, more open economies both achieve higher income levels and grew more rapidly. Countries like Hong Kong, Singapore that have persistently followed more open trade policies have achieved higher income levels and grown more rapidly than more closed economies. During the last 2 decades, trade restrictions have declined sharply, particularly in less developed economies. Following the passage of NAFTA, US trade with both Canada and Mexico grew rapidly, and the US economy performed impressively as the size of trade sector grew during the 1990s. Today, less developed countries are often at the forefront of those pushing for greater trade openness, while high-income countries often impose restrictions in order to protect various domestic industrial interests and preserve their farm subsidy programs. And this is the end of chapter 18.